So, hello everyone and welcome to the third Tuesday talk of the 2021 series. This public talks programme has been developed in collaboration with Lancaster Arts and the LICA Fine Art department at Lancaster University. Over 6 weeks, we've invited artists to share with us original videos around what in the studio means to them. Each 20-ish minute film is followed by a live Q&A discussion. Please feel free to type your questions into the chat box and we'll do our best to get to all of those. Please do keep your audio off unless you have a question. You are welcome to turn your cameras back on after the artist's film. The best way to experience the film is just simply to click on speaker view, and as always the public talk will last around an hour and will aim to be finished by 2. I will now hand over to my colleague James Quinn, who will introduce everyone to this week's artist. Thank you.
Hi everybody, thanks for joining us. Welcome to the third of our Tuesday talks. It's a series of talks that asks artists to discuss the relation between their practice and their studio, whether it be a traditional studio space or a kitchen table. This week I'm pleased to introduce Chris Leach. Chris studied sculpture at London's Wimbledon College and currently lives in Todmorden, West Yorkshire. Chris's most recent exhibitions have taken place at the Custom House Gallery in Westport in Ireland and at the Bury Museum and Art Gallery in Manchester. So in 2014, Chris began work on his Cities project. It's a series of 196 meticulously crafted drawings of every capital city on the planet. And in February of 2021, Chris has got 6 drawings to go. The near completion of this series seems very timely. Each one of Chris's drawings are a mere 7 by 5 centimetres, give or take, small enough to be easily concealed in the palm of one's hand. And one of these tiny drawings, for example, as in Chris's drawing of Mexico City, might represent a population of almost 9 million human beings. So in the midst of a pandemic, the shrinkage of these almost incomprehensible numbers down to an object that might be held in the hand, each one invested with hours of time, gives this body of work, I would argue, an agency that perhaps even Chris could not have imagined when he first started it. The Cities project invites us to reappraise our geographical boundaries, our sense of identity. It asks us perhaps to consider the divisive nature of some of our social and political structures, and perhaps more importantly, to question the nature of our relation to both space and time. If anybody's not familiar with Chris's work, I would urge you to go to his website and have a look at some of the drawings, because it's full of exquisitely beautiful drawings. So please have a look. And I think it's now time to see Chris's film. So Danny, if you could run that, it'd be great.
I don't have and have never really felt the need for a specific studio space. The main focus of my practice are the miniature works, and other than a flat tabletop and decent lighting, there are no other real criteria. The impetus for the work, the shifts in scale, came a few years ago just out of curiosity more than anything. I had a photograph I had taken of a group of people walking down a road which I decided to try to scale down. In a previous incarnation, I used to be a printer and graphic designer, so I was used to looking closely at images to see how they were constructed, sometimes essentially out of only 4 colours in a series of dots. This always intrigued me, and the idea of bringing something down in scale was more of an experiment than anything else. I had done a number of works where the opposite had occurred, where I tried to increase the size of the original image, and I was curious as to how these shifts in scale would operate at a minuscule size with both the image and also in a material sense. I only ever have one piece of work going at a time, the mainstay of my work is derived from photographs which I usually grid out to approximately 1 inch square. This matrix is then lightly redrawn on whatever material I'm using, be it paper or primed wood or board. The surface operates in different ways depending on my aims and intentions. A paper surface is fundamentally different to work on than a primed oak board surface. The ways in which the qualities of line and material operate, the mattness or sheen of the pencil, the chalk and the crayon, the contrasting qualities of waxiness and opaqueness, have totally different systems of operation depending on the material surface. What I guess I'm attempting to do with each piece is to reconcile these different qualities of material, the sheen and opacity, into a kind of layered engineered quality. I work over and work back each material and mark to formulate something recognisable tonally and structurally as the thing that I'm trying to render. The main impetus of my recent work has been the cityscapes. These arose out of a small work I did on paper of the view from the top of one of the twin towers of the World Trade Center in New York. I remember having completed it and being quite startled by what it actually did, both in subject matter and in those kinds of shifts in perspective. I had a bit of a eureka moment with it. The subject matter for my current work has arisen out of a consistency of aim and intention over the last few years. My first forays into shifts in scale were determined, I suppose, purely by experiments in the manipulation of scale and materials. The cityscapes derived from an interest in the geopolitical and spatial relationships of making a drawing or constructing an image, and a kind of inquiry into the consequences of line and demarcation. I was interested in the wider political implications of line, both in a practical and in a philosophical sense. I was interested in how the ideological consequences of making a line on a piece of paper essentially becomes a process of drawing a distinction between one thing and another, becoming not only a mark in space but also the separation of two separate spaces, a delineation or perhaps the rendering of a particular jurisdiction. It is almost as if the topography of the world can be seen as a symptom of that process, which is of course taught at an early age and becomes a way of negotiating temporal and spatial qualities, and also an exercise in essentially possessing and quantifying a position in the world. These things have evolved over time into the world we know or think we know and operate in today. There is an international consensus in the structure of time down to fractions of a millisecond. This is a consensus which has been brought about by a process of knowledge and also a consensus of political power relationships. Our awareness of time and space, our geopolitical relationships are all quantified by relics of a very specific political agenda which dictates where we are in time and space. It is these things that I'm interested in, how we become aware of these relationships and how these relationships can be altered or made apparent, how they are in some respects essential to our functioning as a society, but how they are also in very particular ways a very arbitrary grid that we impose upon the world. The works, the drawings themselves, can take a number of days to complete. They are methodical, and the particular process tends to eliminate any sense of gesture or spontaneity. They are very molecular and basic. Each one is, I think, a construction built piece by piece, and these processes tend to mirror the ways in which the city or the work itself is constructed geometrically, methodically, over time. The drawings are intentionally laboured. They have a specifically durational element to them, so that the work, although tiny, can be seen to be made, and to the viewer to have gone through a very apparent process. The work sits for me into the context of a wider narrative, inquiring into relativities of scale and proximity. A piece of art consists of a series of relational and psychological shifts or narratives that are informed by both the artist, the art, and the relationship that the audience has with the thing that is seen. It is about where you are as a viewer in relation to the particular place. The works are about a composite knowledge of these locations, which are very specific geographically, socially, and politically. The shift in scale does something peculiar psychologically. It allows the viewer a particular kind of focus. It allows the mind to recalibrate, and it allows the eye to examine, to be drawn into the work, to go on a journey with the drawing, and to become aware of the topography and the geometry of a particular place, whilst all the time being conscious of the work being drawn. The surface of the work functions as a kind of screen, a lens within the world. It becomes another layer of information relating to a whole series of operations concerning the structure of the world and my own particular inquiry into it. I've made larger works which do something fundamentally different, but I'm happy with the small works, and I'm happy with that I have found a mechanism and a way in which the viewer can engage in a relationship with the works, which have a very particular process of operation, both materially and psychologically. I think that by miniaturising the world, it becomes, in some sense, a manageable entity. There are spatial and temporal relationships that occur that we make considerable presumptions about, but they function as part of a wider socio-political narrative, brought into being for very particular means and riddled with all kinds of ambiguities and historical baggage. I try to make work that is stripped of metaphor. It is very specific work, unburdened by any kind of narrative fictions. There is, in some sense, a political agenda contextualising the work, but the work itself is also non-political, or perhaps apolitical. It seeks to define the particular spaces depicted with a certain amount of empathy, to be non-judgmental, both culturally and socially. It is also perhaps too about the triumph of capitalism and nation building, but what it also tries to show is that these places and this world is very much a made entity, and therefore can be fundamentally redesigned or remade. The drawings try to show that the world is decidedly and fundamentally a fabrication. I'm aware that there is a certain how did you do that factor to the work, but I think that once the viewer surmounts that and examines the work itself, there are consistent undercurrents structuring the work that allow these other operations to become apparent. The work is laboured and intensive and warrants a degree of close examination and scrutiny. The scale of the work does enforce the viewer to recalibrate their eye, to be drawn into the structure of the work, the mark making, the topography. I've tried to emphasise the mark making in the work to ensure that there is an awareness it is very much a made thing you are looking at and fundamentally not a photograph. I'm not trying to engage in a direct association with photography as such, but the work does have a dislocated relationship to the camera, in that the images are all sourced from the internet and that they are not, at least the vast majority of them are not, places that I have actually visited. There is an element to the works that situates them within a debate about the screen and shifts of meaning, how we construct and deconstruct ourselves within the world, within the context of nationhood and wider society. The drawings allow the viewer to be immersive, to take a metaphysical leap of imagination into the world depicted, but that leap is also only to do with your own particular relationship to that space. Where you are as a viewer relative to your place in space and time is fundamentally important to the operations of the work itself. I think that all drawing is in some way seeking out a knowledge or an inquiry into the world. It seeks to delineate space and provides a mechanism for processing ideas about the world and our relationship to it that can occasionally become overwhelming or perhaps are unthought of. There is a presumption that the world we inhabit is a solid entity, that it exists outside of our control, and although it is true that to an extent we are fundamentally controlled beings, our operations within the world are contained within particular socio-political and environmental constraints. What I am seeking to define is that the world is very much constructed. It is a fabrication made by ourselves to serve our own ends. There is a humanistic element to the work in that we are shown to be objectively looking at spaces which are not framed within a technological or electronic meta-narrative. It is a world made human and fragile, reduced to basic materials. There is a sympathy of means within each of the places that I try to depict that allows the viewer to dislocate themselves from their own sense of being and to immerse themselves in the particular spaces which are made emphatically human. The work is, in a wider sense, about your own jurisdictions and place within the world. It manipulates physical and psychological shifts in scale to facilitate an engagement and awareness of the world which is hopefully unencumbered by a political agenda. The drawings are of course landscapes, and the idea of landscape art has always had very specific political associations to do with nationality or nationhood. Artists have utilised landscape, and their work has been intentionally or not used to formulate imaginative or romantic associations which can drive a nationalistic political narrative. With my work, I'm not interested in the pomp or bombast of place. I want to disassociate my work from any nationalistic tendency. It emphatically aims to sit outside the context of nationhood, but I am aware that it does so by conversely having an obtuse relationship with those kind of ideologies.
Right, it was really fascinating, Chris. I really enjoyed that, and it's prompted so many questions. I really don't know where to start, but I'll start with the first thing that struck me watching that film was this collision of time, different durations, the time invested in the making. I was kind of fascinated by, you know, the age of the oak, you know, the rings on the wood. There was this kind of coalescence of different times, and also, I don't know if you used silver point on those particular pieces, but I know that you've used it on other works. And silver point was a technique that reached its kind of height in the Renaissance and had disappeared by the 18th century. So that's another example of your drawings being the site where kind of a multiplicity of kind of times collide. But not only that, but you started as a sculptor at Wimbledon, and it seems to me that love of materiality of processes also finds its way into the drawings as well. And I wonder if you could just respond to that in some way before I open it up to the students' questions.
I think obviously, you know, the work itself is primarily, there's a lot of research in the materials that are particularly used in this project for different reasons, because I did start it back in 2012, initially using slightly different acrylic gessos, which I'd done about 40 drawings and was having problems with. So I restarted this whole project in 2014. I've been kind of like doing it on and off since then. But yeah, I think, you know, materials and what they do and how they function and how they've been utilized over time are a kind of prime interest in what I'm trying to put forward. And I think as an artist, you can only ever sort of like put a sequence of things or propose a sequence of things and try and engage people in whatever manner you are, you know, able to at the time. Or but I think, yeah, I mean, the work is, you know, very, I don't see it primarily as two-dimensional in any way. Always, it's to do with space and theories of space and theories of you know, how you kind of like, how you sort of witness space, how you engage in space, how your perception of space and time alters or can be altered, or how things operate, I guess. So I'm sort of like interested in not only, you know, condensing those things, but obviously sort of expanding those things, because if you, you know, if you're actually if you're engaging with the sort of minuteness of the work, there's a kind of focus, you very directed into looking, and you know, that focus also has an expansiveness to it as well, because you know, these not only in just the in the visual, but also in the psychological way. And I'm trying to sort of, you know, almost like play with those things, I guess. So yeah.
Right, okay, that's what I'm going to do, Chris, is open the questions up to the students, because they're coming in thick and fast now. So I'm just going to read them out to you. So the first one, do you always prepare the surfaces in the same way, or does it depend on the kind of details you intend to include, for example, cityscape versus more organic landscapes?
Well, with the miniatures, they're all of the miniature cityscapes are primed using rabbit skin gesso and using whiting, and that's made very methodically. But I mean, obviously, I've utilised other materials to produce work. I primarily produce drawings, so you know, a lot of my work is either, you know, is paper based or on panel. If I'm using silver point or gold point or any kind of metal point, you can use all kinds of different, you know, metal material to make metal point drawings outside of silver point. So they all have different kind of hues and tones, and you know, but to make silver point drawings, you need to prime the paper, you need to prime the surface. So I don't use the same process in all my work at all, and I'm kind of interested in, you know, these, I suppose, this whole sort of encyclopedia of knowledge that you can utilize to make things, you know, sort of like the work that I'm doing with the miniatures references panel works, panel drawings, icons, you know, they date back hundreds of years. And that was my main reason for using the materials that I've used for the miniatures, is to do with longevity. So you have all these sort of narratives of time and space, and like you're saying about, you know, the oak itself and the rings, and, you know, the oak itself is kind of cut in a very specific way to minimize the risk, if you like, of each of those blocks expanding and cracking, because obviously, you know, 200-300 years time, they're going to be fundamentally different things.
Right.
Might have totally changed, and, you know, I don't want a big split across New York, or well, New York isn't in the capital cities, obviously. Washington, you might want that, depending who's in power at the time. But anyway, so yeah, I don't really use one process.
Okay, there's another question here which is also kind of related. Abby wants to know, she noticed that some of your cityscapes are made on a dark ground and then carved out. And Abby's wondering what prompted you to make those choices. Also, is it important for you that they are recognizable, that people can identify specific cities within that body? Does that matter?
Not particularly, no. I mean, I've tried to use, I guess, sort of like in certain ways, sort of, you know, certain iconographies, and in other ways I'm not that interested in them. But I mean, with regard to sort of like working on the dark ground and then essentially using a scalpel or a point to kind of like pick out the line, you know, I've used that in, I mean, if you look across the whole body of work, there's various different ways of kind of like, you know, you used those processes to, you know, scratch out or transcribe the information of each particular work. So I mean, I think as a body of work, you know, there are a couple of sort of night ones that I did, which I didn't choose for any particular reason. I just kind of thought over, you know, the whole project. You know, it's obviously, you know, it's the world. They're not all going to be in daylight, but I didn't choose them to, you know, with that in mind. They're just a bit of a kind of random. Oh, I'll try this one at night. So,
but it's worth saying that it seems to me, at least anyway, that the removal of the graphite or the scratching back into the white gesso to make a white line is as important as the actual drawing onto the surface. You know, it's not one, it's both together.
The modulated in each work, you know, sort of, you know, what because I use that process in pretty much every one, you know, to kind of like transcribe things. But it's kind of funny. I've just finished Vatican City, and the view of Vatican City overlooks St. Peter's Square, and then you've got the little statues running around the rim of the building. So I did these little tiny statues, but I've almost kind of like done them in 3D. But they're absolutely minuscule, and it kind of made me laugh when I finished them, because, you know, you've got the different ones all around the rim. So it's kind of funny. It's a bit of a learning curve as well. Each thing. So I quite like the idea of getting into more sort of like sculptural surface over time, but it's just a learning curve.
Right. We're talking of time. Lucy wants to know, on average, how long does it actually take you to create one of your drawings, Chris?
Those smaller cityscapes or the miniatures are, you know, it's usually 3 or 4 days, depending on the detail, essentially. You know, sort of if you're doing the little windows and roofs, and it can be very, very finicky and can be totally head-wrecking. You know, there are some times where I just kind of have to go for a walk because obviously there's a lot of energy and focus going on to produce these things, and it can sort of be a bit brain frying at times.
I can imagine. There's a question from Primrose who is 6.
Hello, Primrose.
She wants to know, how many have you made? How many drawings have you made? Why have you chosen the size? Why are they not bigger or smaller?
Well, I did, like years ago, I had an exhibition in Ireland, and I did a series of cityscapes which were based on cities which were along the prime meridian. So you had sort of London, Paris, working all the way down through kind of basically sort of West Africa. And I think it was about 14 altogether. And this whole capital cities project kind of stemmed out of that idea. I was in a big car crash in 2011, which smashed up my drawing arm. There's a femur plate in it from there to there. And I had like 5 operations on my arm. So I was off work for essentially 2 years. And I wasn't even sure that I was going to be able to draw again, because I had this exhibition planned before the car crash, and then the exhibition was delayed after the car crash, and then about 12 months later we had the exhibition. So I had this kind of mad idea that before I would start getting arthritis in my arm and losing all sense of touch, which is one of the things that came out of the car crash, that all these things are going to accelerate. I thought, I need to do something kind of big with this sort of idea. So I thought, I'll do this cities project. And here I am, like 8, 9 years later, kind of just about to complete it. I mean, that was the main reason for doing it. And it's kind of been my prime focus for almost a decade, which is a lot longer than I anticipated, really. Yeah, it was almost like I'll start it to see if I can do it kind of thing. And I've had moments where I've kind of thought I'll never be able to finish this thing. It's just too big and it's just too completely head-wrecking. But now I'm almost at the end of it. It's like, oh well, what am I going to do now? So we shall see. I've not quite finished it yet. So another 6 to do.
Okay, there's a question from some CL wants to know, because space and scale play a big part in your work, I was wondering if you've considered video art, because your many small pieces could act as small frames in stop frame animation.
I did a talk a while ago at a gallery in Ireland where I had them projected on a screen behind me as I was talking, and they actually looked quite good. And they were on like a cinematic scale. And I mean, I used to play around with scale on my work when I was at uni. I did some film work. One of the pieces was of the Rhino House at London Zoo, where I used a Bolex 16mm camera, clockwork one, just to film the rhinos around that beautiful art. Well, it's not beautiful, quite brutal architectural space that they were in. And I had that projected as a loop. It was about a minute's worth of film, but with the rhino looking quite agitated because the clockwork camera was very loud. So the rhino was kind of pacing round and sort of charging around its enclosure, just round in circles. So I had that filmed, projected, into a huge theatre space. So I've always kind of been interested in those kind of dialogues of time, narrative, and because it was a film, not a video as well, there was a very specific kind of quality to it. So I think I'd like to get back into those kind of things, actually, those narratives, because obviously, drawing and like drawing itself is very stilling. You have to kind of stop and engage with it, and because they're so miniature and so small, they demand almost like I remember Todmorden, chap who was curating another show in Ireland, had said to me, I was a bit of a fascist It's like, you really want to control the way that people look, don't you? And I don't, and I'm not, but I kind of like those ideas of kind of like controlling the space, if you like, between the surface and the viewer. They demand that kind of intensity of looking, and that kind of like recalibration of, because you're a bit kind of like, oh goodness, and it takes time to engage with them, which I like. And
in terms of engagement, this is a really interesting question from Yasmin, and Yasmin asks, you mentioned that the majority of the capital cities you've drawn you haven't visited. To what extent do you feel you develop connections with each of these places as you draw them?
I'm not 100% sure about an answer to that.
It's a tough one.
Like, obviously, to do the project and to kind of be nearing completion, there are certain places that stand out. I think, oh, I'd love to go there. Mainly the South Sea Islands, that kind of place. But then some of the architecture in the Middle Eastern cities are just insane. I don't know, I think some of the more obscure places that, perhaps I'd never really heard of before when I initially started it, kind of piques your interest in these, just in everything, I think. And it's my learning curve as well, because, quite a few places I'd never really heard of at all. And obviously, as I've been going along, I've been kind of reading about places and finding out a little more. So there's that accumulated knowledge.
Yeah, there's a related question here that's kind of similar to Yasmin's, and I guess it's kind of a question about research and the choices that you make about images that you can turn into drawings. How do you find the landscape you want to create? I'm guessing we're talking photographs. And how long does it take time researching to find the composition you want? And do you ever collaborate with photographers to get the composition you want?
I haven't done. Well, I haven't done really with regard to my own work at the moment. Finding the landscape itself, I'm sure at some point somebody's going to say, oh right, that's not that particular city, and I'll have googled it incorrectly or something. Somebody's going to come along at some point and say that's not right, and we'll kind of go with that if and when it happens. I don't know. I've been quite thorough, because I have noticed that there have been a couple of places that I've kind of done, or a couple of works that I've done over the last few years, which have been incorrect. It's not the right place for whatever reason. It's always kind of interesting when that happens.
Mm-hmm.
Where's the rupture? Obviously, you can research places, and but I'm sort of interested. I like those dislocations almost, sort of fake news, if you like.
It's because I think it's a really interesting question, though, because the intentions of the photographer might not match your intentions as an artist making these drawings. They may have been taken for specific purposes. And I suppose I'm wondering, to what extent are you selecting almost as neutral an image as you could possibly find, if that makes sense? The neutral.
Yeah, no, I think certainly with the capital cities drawings, obviously they have to be of that particular place. So I have gone some way to ensure that I've obviously been doing the correct space, and that's relatively easy to do. So what I feel that I do have is something that is truthful to these particular locations, and that's important as part of this particular project. But those questions arise out of this project as well. I could have done 196 drawings of totally different spaces and then proclaimed perhaps that, you know, these are the capital cities of the world. And I kind of think, you know, unless you were really, really going to go into it, a lot of people would just say, yeah, oh, okay, that truth is a given, because you've told me it is true. But I quite like, you know, that those things arise out of this. Those, you know, that, because I'm interested in a wider sense, I guess, in drawing being a purveyor of some kind of truth, and you know what that is might be something purely subjective, or there might be an objective truth in it, which hopefully there is with each of those particular spaces and environments and what they represent. But I think what's kind of interesting is that, you know, through that whole process of drawing, that sort of distillation of things and producing the work and making the work, there's so many questions that arise out of essentially what that thing itself is, but also what that process has involved and what it represents as well in a future, in a future sense. Or so I don't think they're conclusive. I like that, you know, these 196 capital cities, although at this particular moment feel like this is the world, even in 20, 30, 40 years, that's going to totally alter, you know. So it's always going to be a picture of something in time and space. And, you know, it will never be a conclusive truth. You know, it will alter over time, you know, and, you know, some of these places will cease to exist totally, you know, not as physical environments, but as what they represent. You know, like the capital of Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore. It still exists as a city, but it represents something else. So I quite like that narrative of sort of truth and representation is completely objective, and, you know, involves a whole sequence of relationships, relating to, you know, whoever's viewing it, or relating to, you know, these expanses of time. And yeah.
There's a question from Laura here, which is this is kind of related to the research, and she asks an interesting question. Are there any legal repercussions about drawing from somebody else's photographic image? Because I remember the painter Luke Toymans was done a few years ago, wasn't he, for plagiarism, for using somebody's photograph?
I'm sure there are, because, you know, obviously Google, when I first started off, or whatever web search facility I was utilising at the time back in 2012 or 2014, you know, there was no legal rights to a particular image. So, you know, basically I'm stealing all these things that obviously somebody somewhere has taken. So yeah, but I think what I'm doing is obviously kind of like altering them in such a way as to make them my own. You know, they are not these things. You know, they're not the original image itself. They're totally different. But obviously a good solicitor at some point could possibly argue, no, all of this work is owned by Google, or someone else. So yeah, no, I've been very conscious of that. And you know, the question of rights and image rights relating to whoever produced that thing. But I've produced something else, so I'm not quite sure that, you know, what the actual legal distinctions are. But yeah, no, it's absolutely a question that's sort of intrigued me, that, you know, if it's ever sold, as a project to whoever that might be, is somebody else going to come along and say, that's not your money? So, I don't know.
Hannah asks, have you ever asked a photographer for permission?
I've never really used images which are from a particular photographer, and I have a number of times, not for this project anyway, but in other work that I've done, I have used images that have been taken. Like I was doing a series of silver point drawings in New York, and I was wanting a very, very particular image of a street corner in New York to do with the project I was working on, and I couldn't find an image for that particular space. So basically, I kind of asked someone to take a photograph for me of it, which they did, and they're obviously referenced whenever that works. Well, they're not really referenced when that's shown. I got permission to make a piece of work from the photograph. So normally I don't at all.
There's a related question here from R.L. Wilson, who wants to know, would you say then that your work is a collaboration, and would you work from your own photographs?
I do work from my own photographs. I did as part of a bit of a break from the work. I did a whole series of little miniature fields, which were all fields, just expanses of field, but done like that big. And they're all silver point drawings, and they were all taken from images that I'd taken myself, and that was part of the reason for doing them, that they were spaces that I had actually been into, but that was one particular project, and worked for that particular thing in itself. So it's not always, it just depends really, I guess, on what the aim and intention is.
Right.
Things.
Okay, there's a question here that kind of goes back to some of the things you've discussed previously in terms of the relationship between subject matter and the materials that you choose to use. So the question is there a relationship between the cityscapes you draw and the material you choose to draw on? What strays you away from working on traditional mediums like paper? Well, I think you do work on paper, but what is it about those wooden blocks?
They're objects, and I quite like that they are objects, because I could have done these on paper and they would have had a totally different narrative, you know, and because these things, the way I imagine them when I've finished is that they're kind of displayed off the wall in space, you know, so they have their own particular sculpturalness and objectness to them, in a way that, you know, something which is essentially wall-based work does not have at all. So they're almost like a little invasion into your own space.
How are you going to show these, Chris? Will you show them as a grid or as kind of a linear encounter?
I'm looking for spaces at the moment. When I was in Ireland, there was a space in Dublin which was a huge hexagonal exhibition space, which was built in, I think, the 1780s. It's the first exhibition space that was built in Ireland. And I remember seeing some images of it and thinking, oh, that's perfect, because basically you would go in one door, circumnavigate the whole project, and then come back out. And that's, I want them, I visualize them to be in a line, you know, with just around the room. And I don't want any kind of like hierarchy within them. I want them, you know, level. So that, you know, because one of the things about the first almost draft of the project that I did was that there were different fluctuations in the size of the blocks, and it just didn't work, even just for that, for the aesthetic, for those kind of aesthetic reasons. So, you know, I was having a problem with the materials as well, so I decided to abandon it. And I've done this project, every block is the same size, so there's no sense of those, you know, even slight distinctions. You know, every particular capital city is exactly the same size. So it's all about these kind of like equilibriums, I guess. And sort of, we never think of, you know, nations as the same. There aren't hierarchies on it, you know. And whatever narrative we choose to sort of think about them, and I quite like that, you know, this particular project kind of like tries to undermine that in some way, you know, in a very, you know, in my own way, but you know, I'm just trying to say, you know, this thing in itself, the world, you know, it's non-hierarchical. So I guess.
Okay, there's we're running out of time rapidly, but I want to get this question in because I think it's quite an interesting one from Jared, who says that you stressed in the film that the world is a fabrication or a construction. Did this realization come as a result of your drawing cities? What implications does this understanding have for you? So, how do you respond to that?
I think I don't know. It's interesting that, you know, sort of like, obviously what you're doing is portraying a world which is, like I was saying in the video, is very much a construction, you know, and it's construction both psychologically in the way that we view the world, politically in the way it's constructed, physically in the way that it's built, and all of these things are obviously a construction can be dismantled and can be rebuilt or can be reformulated in some way or another. And I don't have any answers to that at all. But, you know, I think that is, I think politically that's, you know, it's a hard question to look at because we're constantly in environments that are totally manipulated. These spaces that we, you know, use each day are, you know, I mean, there's vast tracts of research about the way that our psychology alters within different spaces, within different hospitals and schools, and external and internally, and how that alters our own responses. But I kind of think, you know, in a wider kind of context, culturally, you know, sort of, I think, you know, obviously what you're aiming towards a kind of like utopian ideal of what the world could be, but with no particular answer for it. But it's just kind of saying, oh, here is the world, but we can kind of alter it. It doesn't have to be this way. So somebody asked me this a while ago, saying, you know, is it optimistic or pessimistic to kind of do this project? And, you know, what are your aims and intentions? And, you know, my kind of like optimistic self says, you know, this is construction and it can be altered. My kind of pessimistic self says, you know, this is the environment you're within and this is what you're dealing with, and it's too big for you, so forget about it. So I don't know, I kind of fluctuate between those two things constantly.
Okay, I've got one last question, Chris, which again is a kind of question about time. You've done 190 something drawings. What keeps you going when you really can't face it anymore? Because I've had the experience of doing the kind of repetitive process. There's, you know, a lot of industry, a lot of time involved, a lot of work, a lot of looking and thinking. what keeps you motivated? There must be times when you just, that's it, I've had enough.
Oh yeah. I don't know. I'm not quite 100% sure. I think doggedness and kind of, because it's such a daft thing to do. I always I remember thinking of it originally years ago and kind of thinking, that's a really stupid idea. But then just kind of thinking, well, I could do it. And now I'm sort of at the end of it, and it's a bit like, oh, geez. And I don't know how I'm going to respond when it's actually done, because I haven't really made any sort of forays into, proper kind of forays into where and when it's going to be displayed. I've just kind of put all my energy into trying to finish it, and that is, it's a big ask kind of thing, but it's a bit of a legacy project. So I don't know. I think that kind of thing, I'm not quite sure where the motivation comes from, other than kind of set myself something to say, right, I can do this. It's kind of possible. It's slightly bonkers, but I'll eventually get it done. And it's I'm pleased with how it's progressed. It's progressed on and off over the last 8-9 years, really. So it's I've gone off and done other things and made other work. But
you have invested an awful lot of time and effort in making sure that this body of work is going to be around for a long time. And I thought that was really interesting. Because often artists will kind of just whip something off and it's gone, it's disappeared. But in a way, you're rescuing this body of work from time itself by ensuring, by using, centuries-old techniques, by using wood, oak, and rabbit-sized glue, that they're actually going to be around for 300 years, hopefully.
Yeah, I'm also aware that it could all disappear in a fire.
It could, yeah, it could.
They're very combustible. So
right.
There's a fragility to them as well, which is, although they are made to have a longevity to them, they are fragile things, and I kind of quite like that as part of the question itself, into those ideas.
Right. We're going to have to wrap it up there, Chris. We've hit the end of this particular section. I'm getting lots of positive feedback from the students. They've really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
So what's going to happen is we're going to have a 15